In November 1944, Evelyn Whitmore took off from a military airfield in Delaware on what her family was told was a routine ferry mission, delivering a P-47 Thunderbolt to the West Coast. Her aircraft never arrived. The Army Air Forces sent a telegram 3 weeks later, lost over the English Channel during transit to Britain. No wreckage recovered, no further investigation warranted. Her 3-year-old son Robert grew up without answers. He spent 60 years searching military records, writing letters to the War Department, begging anyone who would listen to tell him what happened to his mother. He died in 1998, still searching. Then in 2014, a violent winter storm tore through the Ardennes forest in Belgium, 4,000 miles from the English Channel. Forestry workers found a P-47 Thunderbolt buried under 70 years of growth. The serial number matched an aircraft that had officially crashed into the sea. The fuselage was riddled with bullet holes consistent with German ground fire. 30 meters from the wreckage, beneath a cross made of hand-placed stones, they found a shallow grave. And inside the flight jacket wrapped around the remains, investigators discovered something that would force the military to reveal a classified program so sensitive it had remained buried for 8 decades. A covert operation that sent American women into combat over Nazi-occupied Europe, then erased them when they didn't come home. Daniel Whitmore was reviewing a procurement fraud case when his desk phone rang. It was a Tuesday morning in March, the kind of gray Virginia day that made the fluorescent lights in the OSI field office feel even harsher than usual. Danny had been with the Air Force Office of Special Investigations for 16 years. He'd worked counterintelligence in Afghanistan, fraud cases at 3 different stateside bases, and a 2-year stint chasing contractor kickbacks at the Pentagon. He was 44 years old, recently divorced, and very good at finding things people wanted to stay hidden. The phone rang again. He glanced at the caller ID. Pentagon extension, but not one he recognized. He picked up on the 3rd ring. The voice on the other end identified himself as Colonel Marcus Webb, Defense POW/MIA Accounting Agency. Danny knew the organization. They handled recovery and identification of service members' remains from past conflicts. Korea, Vietnam, occasionally World War II, when something turned up in a farmer's field in France or a construction site in the Pacific. Colonel Webb's tone was careful, measured, the way people sound when they are about to deliver news they don't fully understand themselves. Special Agent Whitmore, I'm calling about a recovery operation in Belgium. We've identified remains that appear to be connected to your family. Danny's first thought was his father. Robert Whitmore had served in Korea, came home with a Silver Star and a limp he never talked about. But his father had died in 1998 in a VA hospital in Richmond. Danny had been there. He'd watched them lower the casket into Virginia clay. I'm sorry, Colonel, I don't understand. Connected how? A pause, paper shuffling. The remains belong to a woman. Based on artifacts recovered at the site, we believe she may be your grandmother, Evelyn Whitmore. Danny didn't respond. The name landed somewhere in his chest and stayed there, heavy and cold. Evelyn Whitmore. He'd heard the name maybe a dozen times in his entire life. His father almost never spoke about her. Just fragments, delivered in that flat voice Robert used when he didn't want to feel something. She was a pilot. She died in the war. I was 3 years old. There was one photograph. Danny had seen it once in a shoebox his father kept in the back of a closet. A young woman in a flight suit standing beside an airplane, smiling at whoever held the camera. Dark hair pinned back, eyes squinting against the sun. She looked like she was about to laugh. That was all Danny knew about his grandmother. A photograph and a silence that stretched across 3 generations. Agent Whitmore, are you still there? Danny realized he'd been holding his breath. Yes, I'm here. How is that possible? She died in 1944, over the English Channel. Another pause, longer this time. That's what we need to discuss. The recovery site is in the Ardennes forest, approximately 15 kilometers from the German border. The remains were found alongside a P-47 Thunderbolt that matches the serial number of an aircraft officially listed as lost over the Channel. Colonel Webb's voice tightened slightly. There are some inconsistencies we're trying to resolve. Given your background and your family connection, we thought you might want to be involved in the identification process. Inconsistencies. Danny had spent his career investigating inconsistencies. He knew what the word meant when spoken by a military officer in that particular tone. It meant something was wrong. It meant someone, somewhere, had lied. "I'll be on the next flight," Danny said. He hung up before Webb could respond. That night, Danny sat on the floor of his apartment surrounded by cardboard boxes. After his father died, Danny had inherited everything, which wasn't much. Robert Whitmore had lived simply. A small house in Newport News, a pension, a closet full of flannel shirts and military memorabilia, and boxes. Dozens of boxes filled with papers, photographs, and documents that Danny had never fully sorted through. He'd told himself he'd get to it eventually. 16 years later, most of the boxes were still taped shut, stacked in a storage unit he paid $40 a month to ignore. Now he sat cross-legged on the carpet, working through them one by one, looking for anything about Evelyn. The first 3 boxes were useless. Tax returns from the 1970s, his father's discharge papers from Korea. Birthday cards Danny had sent as a child, saved for reasons he couldn't understand. The 4th box was different. It was smaller than the others, older, the cardboard soft with age. No label. Danny cut the tape and lifted the flaps. Inside, he found his father's search. Letters to the War Department dating back to 1952. Requests for records under the Freedom of Information Act. Correspondence with the National Archives, the Air Force Historical Research Agency, veterans organizations. Decades of inquiries all asking the same question: what happened to Evelyn Whitmore? The responses were uniform: polite refusals, claims that no additional records existed, suggestions that the matter had been thoroughly investigated in 1944 and no further action was warranted. But Robert had kept searching, year after year, letter after letter. A man trying to find his mother in a bureaucracy designed to keep her hidden. Danny found the photograph near the bottom of the box, the same one he remembered from childhood, Evelyn in her flight suit, squinting into the sun. But now he noticed details he'd missed before. The aircraft behind her wasn't a small trainer. It was a P-47 Thunderbolt, a fighter plane, the kind of aircraft that went to war. Beneath the photograph was a newspaper clipping, brittle and yellow. The Harrisburg Courier, June 1943. Local woman joins women pilots program. A short article about Evelyn Whitmore, 24, who had been accepted into the Women's Flying Training Detachment at Avenger Field, Texas. The article described her as an accomplished civilian pilot eager to serve her country. There was a quote from Evelyn herself: "If the men are going to fight, the least we can do is fly the planes to them. I just want to do my part." Danny stared at the photograph for a long time. His grandmother had been dead for 70 years. His father had spent his entire adult life trying to understand why. And now, somehow, she had resurfaced in a Belgian forest, 4,000 miles from where she was supposed to have died. He thought about his father, Robert Whitmore, who had carried this mystery like a stone in his chest for 6 decades, who had written letters and made phone calls and never stopped asking questions, who had died without answers, in a hospital bed with Danny holding his hand. The last thing his father ever said to him was about the weather, something about how it looked like rain. But maybe what he'd wanted to say was something else. Maybe he'd wanted to say, find her. Find out what really happened. Don't let them keep lying. Danny carefully placed the photograph back in the box. He closed the flaps and pressed the tape down flat. Then he opened his laptop and booked a flight to Brussels. The Ardennes in late March was a place caught between seasons. Danny's flight landed in Brussels just after dawn. A rental car and 3 hours of driving brought him to a small town called Vilsalm, nestled in the hills of eastern Belgium. The landscape shifted as he drove, flat farmland giving way to rolling forests, dense stands of pine and beech that pressed close against the narrow roads. This was where the Battle of the Bulge had been fought. Danny knew the history. December 1944. German forces launched a massive surprise offensive through these forests, trying to split the Allied lines. Tens of thousands died in the snow. The trees still carried shrapnel in their trunks. A Belgian federal police officer named Sergeant Luc Fontaine met him at a municipal building in Vielsalm. Fontaine was in his 50s, with the weathered face of a man who'd spent his career in rural postings. He spoke English with a heavy accent, but communicated clearly enough. "The site is difficult to reach," Fontaine explained as they walked to his vehicle. "The storm brought down many trees. We had to cut a path just to get the recovery team in." They drove for 20 minutes on paved roads, then another 30 on a logging track that barely deserved the name. The SUV bounced over roots and ruts, branches scraping against the windows. Finally, Fontaine pulled to a stop beside a cluster of other vehicles: Belgian military, a forensics van, a truck with Defense POW/MIA accounting agency stenciled on the side. Danny stepped out into cold, damp air. The forest surrounded him completely. No buildings visible, no power lines, just trees in every direction, their bare branches reaching toward a gray sky. "This way," Fontaine said. They walked for 15 minutes along a trail marked with orange tape. The ground was soft from recent rain, and Danny's boots sank with each step. The smell hit him first: decomposing leaves, wet earth, something metallic underneath. Then the sounds: voices ahead, the whine of a generator, the rhythmic scrape of tools against metal. The trees opened into a clearing that shouldn't have existed. The storm had done its work here. Massive oaks lay toppled, their root systems torn from the earth, leaving craters 10 feet deep. Sawdust hung in the air where crews had cut through fallen timber, and in the center of the devastation, surrounded by forensic technicians and military personnel, sat the wreckage of a P-47 Thunderbolt. Danny stopped walking. His legs simply refused to carry him forward. The aircraft was half buried in the forest floor, its nose dug into the earth at a steep angle. 70 years of growth had tried to consume it. Moss covered the fuselage in thick green patches, vines wrapped around the propeller blades, saplings had sprouted through gaps in the wing panels. But the basic shape was unmistakable. The distinctive profile of the Thunderbolt, the largest single-engine fighter of the war. A machine built for combat. He forced himself to move closer. The forensic team had cleared vegetation from the fuselage, exposing the bare metal beneath. The original paint scheme was long gone, replaced by rust and corrosion. But Danny could still make out faded markings, a serial number on the tail, partially obscured but legible. A man in civilian clothes approached, American, gray-haired, wearing a jacket with the DPAA logo. He introduced himself as Dr. Paul Hendricks, the lead forensic anthropologist on the recovery team. "Special Agent Whitmore?" Hendricks extended his hand. "I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. I understand this is personal for you." Danny shook the hand, but couldn't find words. His eyes kept returning to the aircraft. Hendricks seemed to understand. He led Danny around the wreckage, narrating what they'd found. The aircraft came down at a shallow angle, not a crash in the traditional sense, more like a controlled descent that ran out of room. The pilot was trying to land. She found the clearest spot she could and put it down. She survived the landing? "We believe so. The cockpit structure is largely intact. There's no indication of impact trauma to the pilot's position." Hendricks paused. "But that's not where we found the remains." He led Danny past the aircraft, through a gap in the fallen trees, to a smaller clearing 30 meters away. The grave was marked with stones. Someone had arranged them carefully, forming a cross perhaps 2 feet wide. Decades of leaf litter had partially buried them, but the pattern was unmistakable. This wasn't random. This was deliberate. Someone had taken the time to honor whoever lay beneath. The forensic team had excavated the site with painstaking care. Yellow flags marked where artifacts had been found. A grid of string divided the area into sections. "We recovered the remains 5 days ago," Hendricks said quietly. "Female, consistent with the physical profile in military records. Clothing fragments match WASP flight gear, the women's ferrying squadron. And we found these." He handed Danny a clear evidence bag. Inside were dog tags, tarnished, corroded, but still readable. "Whitmore, Evelyn M., Danny's hands began to shake. He'd spent 3 days preparing for this moment, the flight, the drive, the walk through the forest. He'd told himself he was ready. He was an investigator. He dealt with death and evidence and uncomfortable truths for a living. But nothing prepared him for holding his grandmother's dog tags in his hands. There's something else. Hendricks produced a second evidence bag. We found this inside the flight jacket, wrapped in oilcloth, remarkably preserved. A letter, folded, yellowed, but intact. Danny could see handwriting through the plastic, neat cursive, faded to brown. We haven't opened it, Hendricks said. Chain of custody, but given the context, we believe it may be personal correspondence, addressed to someone named Robert. Danny's throat closed. His father's name. She'd written a letter. Dying in this forest 70 years ago, his grandmother had written a letter to her 3-year-old son, and it had waited here in the cold Belgian earth while Robert Whitmore grew up and grew old and died without ever knowing. Who buried her? Danny's voice came out rough. Someone made that grave. Someone placed those stones. Hendricks shook his head. We don't know. Local records show no military activity in this specific area during the war. No partisan camps, no known engagements. Whoever buried her, they didn't report it to anyone. Sergeant Fontaine spoke up. The resistance operated throughout this region, armée secrète. Many of them died in the fighting that winter or scattered after liberation. Memories were lost. Danny turned back to the aircraft. From this angle, he could see what the moss had hidden before. The fuselage was pockmarked with small holes, dozens of them, clustered along the engine cowling and the wing roots. Those aren't crash damage, he said. No. Hendricks followed his gaze. Those are bullet holes. Ground fire, based on the angle of penetration. Someone was shooting at this aircraft from below. She was in combat. It appears so. Danny walked back toward the wreckage. He circled it slowly, counting the holes. The damage was concentrated on the left side of the aircraft, suggesting she'd been in a banking turn when the fire hit her. The engine cowling was shredded in places. A fuel line strike, maybe? Something that would have forced her down, but not killed her outright. His grandmother had been shot down. Not over the English Channel on a ferry mission, but here, in occupied Belgium, flying combat against German forces. Everything his family had been told was a lie. Agent Whitmore? Hendricks had followed him. Are you all right? Danny stared at the bullet holes for a long moment. Somewhere in his chest, something cold and sharp was beginning to bloom. Not grief, not yet. Something closer to recognition. The feeling he got at the start of every investigation when the first piece of evidence told him the official story was wrong. I need to see her military records, he said. Everything. WASP service file, transfer orders, flight logs. All of it. We can arrange that. Danny looked back at the grave, the stones arranged with care by hands he would never know. And I need to find out who buried her. Danny spent the flight home staring at photographs on his phone. He'd taken dozens at the crash site, the wreckage from every angle, the bullet holes, counted and catalogued, the grave with its careful arrangement of stones, the dog tags in their evidence bag. He swiped through them over and over, as if repetition might force them to make sense. 4,000 miles from where she was supposed to have died. Combat damage on an aircraft flown by a woman officially restricted to ferry duty. A body buried by unknown hands in an unmarked grave. None of it fit the story his family had been told. The plane landed at Dulles just after midnight. Danny drove straight to his apartment, showered, and was at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis by the following afternoon. He'd called ahead, used his OSI credentials to expedite access. Military records of deceased service members were technically public, but the bureaucracy moved slowly unless someone pushed. Danny pushed. Evelyn Whitmore's official file was thin, disturbingly thin, 11 pages. That was all that remained of his grandmother's military service, a woman who had flown for nearly 2 years, who had been qualified on pursuit aircraft, who had logged hundreds of flight hours, reduced to 11 pages of faded typescript and carbon copies. Danny spread the documents across a reading room table and went through them one by one. Application to the Women's Flying Training Detachment dated April 1943. Evelyn had listed 340 hours of civilian flight time earned at a small airfield outside Harrisburg. She'd been working as a secretary and spending every spare dollar on flying lessons. Her instructor's recommendation described her as an exceptional natural pilot with unusual spatial awareness and mechanical aptitude. Training records from Avenger Field, Texas. She'd graduated in September 1943, Class 43W5, near the top of her cohort. Qualified on single-engine trainers, then advanced trainers, then, unusually, cleared for pursuit transition training. Transfer orders assigning her to the 2nd Ferrying Group at Newcastle Army Air Base in Delaware. Flight logs showing dozens of ferry missions throughout 1944. P-47 Thunderbolts mostly, factory to depot, depot to embarkation point, the unglamorous but essential work of moving aircraft from where they were built to where they were needed. Then, nothing. The final document was a casualty report dated December 3, 1944. One paragraph. Wasp, Evelyn M. Whitmore, lost during ferry transit, presumed deceased. Aircraft last observed departing Newcastle AAB on November 12, 1944. Destination Oakland Municipal Airport. Failed to arrive at scheduled refueling stop. Subsequent investigation concluded aircraft was lost over water, likely English Channel during transatlantic repositioning flight. No wreckage recovered, no witnesses. Case closed. Danny read the paragraph 3 times. It made no sense. A ferry flight from Delaware to California wouldn't go anywhere near the English Channel. The routing was wrong. The geography was impossible. Either the report contained a catastrophic clerical error, or someone had written it knowing it was false. He photographed every page. Then he started making phone calls. The National Archives in College Park, Maryland, held the bulk of declassified military records from World War II. Danny arrived the next morning with a legal pad full of questions and a growing sense that he was pulling at a thread attached to something much larger than one missing pilot. He requested everything related to WASP operations in late 1944. Flight assignments, transfer orders, casualty reports. The archivists were helpful, but warned him that many records from the period were incomplete. The WASP had been a civilian organization, technically not part of the military. When the program was disbanded in December 1944, record-keeping had been inconsistent. Danny also requested OSS files. The Office of Strategic Services had been the wartime predecessor to the CIA, America's first organized intelligence agency. If his grandmother had been involved in something covert, something beyond ferry duty, the OSS was the most likely candidate. The OSS records were harder to access. Many remained classified even after 70 years. But a significant portion had been released in the 1980s and 1990s, and Danny had the credentials to request expedited review of anything that might be relevant. He spent 3 days in the archives. 12 hours a day, working through boxes of yellowed documents, cross-referencing names and dates, building a timeline of his grandmother's final months. On the second day, he found the first anomaly. It was a personnel requisition form, dated September 1944. Someone in the OSS Special Operations Branch had submitted a request for female pilots with pursuit aircraft qualification for unspecified special duty. The request had been routed through unofficial channels. No standard Army Air Forces paperwork, no formal transfer orders. Just a handwritten memo attached to a list of 5 names. Evelyn Whitmore was third on the list. Danny's hands went cold. He photographed the document and kept searching, cross-referencing the other 4 names against WASP records. What he found made his stomach drop. Margaret Ellison, WASP Class 43W4, qualified on P-47S. Official record, killed in a training accident at Avenger Field, October 1944. Dorothy Brennan, WASP Class 43W6, qualified on P-51S and P-47S. Official record, lost during ferry transit, aircraft presumed crashed in the Gulf of Mexico, November 1944. Ruth Carver, WASP Class 44W1, qualified on P-47S. Official record, killed in a landing accident at Newcastle AAB, November 1944. Francis Dahl, Wasp Class 43, W7, qualified on P-51S. Official record, lost during ferry transit, location unknown, December 1944. 5 women, all qualified on fighter aircraft, all recruited for special duty in September 1944. All dead within 4 months. Danny sat back in his chair. The reading room was quiet, just the hum of climate control and the rustle of other researchers turning pages. But his heart was pounding like he'd just run a sprint. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a single tragedy that had been misreported or mishandled. This was a pattern. 5 women, recruited together, dead together, their fates scattered across different official explanations that didn't hold up to scrutiny. Someone had erased them, all of them. That evening, Danny called Dr. Catherine Shaw. Shaw was a historian at Texas Woman's University, home to the official WASP archives. Danny had found her name in a footnote while researching. She'd spent 20 years documenting the lives of women pilots in World War II. If anyone knew about irregularities in WASP records, it would be her. She answered on the 3rd ring. Danny introduced himself, explained his connection to Evelyn Whitmore, described what he'd found. Shaw was quiet for a long moment. "I've heard rumors," she said finally. "Over the years, whispers from some of the surviving WASPs, before they passed. Stories about women being recruited for something beyond ferrying, something secret." "What kind of something?" "No one ever said directly. The women who knew wouldn't talk about it. Sworn to secrecy, they said. Took it to their graves." Shaw paused. "I always assumed it was just the fog of war. Old memories getting confused. But you're saying you found documentation?" "A requisition form, 5 names. All 5 women died within months of being recruited." Another silence. When Shaw spoke again, her voice had changed, harder, more focused. "Agent Whitmore, I've been studying the WASP for 2 decades. I've interviewed hundreds of women, reviewed thousands of documents. And there have always been gaps, records that should exist but don't. Deaths that were explained too quickly, investigated too little." She took a breath. "I never had proof that something was being hidden, but I always suspected." "Do you have names? Anyone I could talk to who might know more?" "Most of them are gone now, but there might be one." He heard papers shuffling. "There was a man, OSS, worked in special operations during the war. He reached out to me about 10 years ago, said he had information about WASP casualties that had never been made public. But he got cold feet, said he couldn't talk about it, that he'd made promises." "Is he still alive?" "Last I heard, yes, living in a retirement community somewhere in Virginia. His name is William Price." Danny wrote the name down, underlined it twice. "Dr. Shaw, what do you think happened to these women?" The historian was quiet for a moment. When she answered, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I think they were used for something dangerous, something that was never supposed to see the light of day. And when they died, someone decided it was easier to bury the truth than explain it." Danny thanked her and hung up. He stared at the name on his legal pad. William Price, a man who had reached out once, then retreated, who knew something but couldn't, or wouldn't, say what. 5 women, 5 deaths, 70 years of silence. Danny was going to find out why. Danny flew back to Belgium 2 weeks later. He'd spent the intervening days chasing paper trails. OSS records that led to other OSS records. Declassification requests that disappeared into bureaucratic limbo. Phone calls to military historians who expressed interest but couldn't offer answers. The name William Price sat on his legal pad, circled and underlined, but Danny wasn't ready for that conversation yet. He needed more information first. He needed to understand what he was walking into, and he needed to know who had buried his grandmother. The forensic team had done their work. Evelyn's remains were being processed for repatriation, her DNA cross-referenced against samples Danny had provided. The identification would be official within weeks. But the question that haunted him wasn't about bones and dog tags. It was about the stones arranged in a cross, placed with care by hands that had known she mattered. Someone had found her. Someone had honored her. And then they had kept her secret for 70 years. Sergeant Fontaine met him at the Brussels airport. The Belgian officer had been helpful during Danny's first visit, and when Danny explained what he was looking for, Fontaine had made some calls. "The resistance archives are incomplete," Fontaine said as they drove east toward the Ardennes. "Many records were destroyed during the war or lost in the chaos after liberation, but there are families who remember. Stories passed down. Anyone who might know about an American pilot?" Fontaine glanced at him. "Perhaps. I found a man. His father was armée secrète, operated in the region near where your grandmother was found. The son is old now, in his 80s, but his mind is still sharp. He agreed to meet with you." They drove for 2 hours, the landscape growing more rugged as they climbed into the hills. The forests here were dense and ancient, the kind of terrain that could swallow secrets whole. Danny watched the trees pass and thought about his grandmother, bleeding out in a clearing somewhere beneath these branches, writing a letter to a son she would never see again. The village was called Trois Ponts, a handful of stone buildings clustered around a church, surrounded by farmland and forest. Fontaine parked in front of a small house with blue shutters and a garden that showed signs of careful tending, despite the early spring chill. An old man was waiting for them on the porch. Henri Caron was 86 years old. He had the weathered face of someone who had spent his life outdoors, deep lines carved around his eyes and mouth. His handshake was firm, his gaze direct. He studied Danny for a long moment before speaking. "You have her eyes," he said in accented English. "The American woman. I've seen photographs. You have her eyes." Danny felt something shift in his chest. "You knew about her?" Henry gestured for them to follow him inside. The house was small but immaculate, filled with old furniture and older memories. Photographs lined the walls, family portraits spanning generations, formal military images, a young man in resistance clothing holding a rifle. "My father," Henry said, noticing Danny's gaze. "Armée secrète. He joined in 1942 when he was 19 years old. Fought until liberation. Almost didn't survive." They sat at a wooden table in the kitchen. Henri's wife, a small woman with white hair, brought coffee and then disappeared, leaving them alone. "Sergeant Fontaine told me why you've come." Henri wrapped his hands around his cup, staring into the dark liquid. "I've waited many years for someone to ask these questions. I wasn't sure anyone ever would." "Your father found her?" Henri nodded slowly. "November 1944, late in the month, the 20th or 21st, my father was never certain of the exact date. He was part of a cell operating in the forest east of here, monitoring German troop movements, reporting to the Allies by radio. They heard the aircraft come down. The engine sound was wrong, sputtering, dying, then nothing." He paused, gathering the memory. "They waited until dark to investigate. German patrols were everywhere. The front was close, and the enemy was nervous. My father and 2 other men went into the forest with lanterns and found the clearing where the plane had come down." "The P-47. "Yes, a big American fighter. My father had seen them in the sky many times, but never on the ground. It was damaged badly, holes in the metal, the engine torn apart. But the pilot had landed it, not crashed. Landed." Henry looked up at Danny. His eyes were wet. "She was 30 meters from the aircraft, sitting against a tree. My father said she looked peaceful, like she was sleeping. But there was blood, on her jacket, on the ground around her. She had been wounded. Internal injuries from the landing, they thought, or perhaps from the bullets that hit the plane. She had dragged herself away from the wreckage and sat down to rest." Danny's throat tightened. "She was already dead when they found her?" "Yes, perhaps an hour, perhaps 2. Her body was still warm." Henry's voice cracked slightly. "She was holding a pen. There was paper in her lap. A letter, my father said, addressed to someone. A child's name. She had spent her last moments writing to her son." The kitchen was silent except for the ticking of a clock on the wall. "They buried her there," Henry continued. "My father and the others. They couldn't move her far. German patrols would have found them. So they dug a grave in the clearing, wrapped her in her flight jacket, and placed stones to mark the spot. A cross, so she wouldn't be forgotten. Why didn't they report it? After the war? Henry's face darkened. They planned to. My father intended to tell the Americans as soon as liberation came, but 3 weeks later the Germans attacked. The Ardennes offensive. What you call the Battle of the Bulge. Danny nodded. He knew the history. December 16th, 1944. The last major German offensive of the war, launched through these very forests. My father's cell was caught in the fighting. One of the men who helped bury the American woman was killed in the first days. The other disappeared, captured by the Germans, my father believed, though he was never certain. My father himself was badly wounded. He spent months recovering in a hospital in Liège. Henry spread his hands. By the time he was well enough to return, the war was over. The Americans had gone home. And my father, he was a simple farmer's son. He didn't know how to contact the military authorities, didn't know who to tell. He went back to the clearing once in the summer of 1945 to make sure the grave was still there. It was. The forest was already beginning to reclaim it. But he never told anyone? He told me. Henri's voice was quiet. When I was a boy, he took me to the forest and showed me the place. He said there was an American woman buried there, a pilot who had fought against the Germans and died alone in the woods. He said we must never forget her, even if no one else remembered. Danny leaned forward. Do you know what she was doing there? Why an American woman was flying a fighter plane over Belgium? Henri shook his head. My father didn't know. He assumed she was resistance, perhaps, or a spy. He never imagined she was a regular soldier. Women didn't fly combat missions. Everyone knew that. Everyone knew that, except the people who had sent her. My father kept something, Henri said. He rose slowly from the table and crossed to a wooden cabinet against the wall. He opened a drawer and removed a small box, carrying it back to Danny with both hands. He found this near her body. He meant to return it someday to her family, but he never knew how. Danny opened the box. Inside was a compass, military issue, the kind pilots used for navigation. The glass was cracked, the metal casing dented, but it was still intact. On the back, someone had scratched initials, E.M.W., Evelyn Margaret Whitmore. Danny held the compass in his palm. His grandmother had held this same object 70 years ago, using it to navigate across occupied Europe. It had guided her on her final mission. And then it had waited, passed from one generation to another, for someone to come looking. Thank you, Danny said. His voice didn't sound like his own. Henry reached across the table and gripped Danny's hand. Find out what happened to her, the old man said. My father never could, but you can. Find out why she was there and make sure the world knows she mattered. Danny looked at the compass in his hand, the cracked glass, the scratched initials. I will, he said. I promise. Danny didn't open the letter until he was alone. He'd returned to his hotel in Vilsam, a small inn with thick stone walls and windows that looked out over the forested hills. The room was simple, a bed, a desk, a chair by the window. He sat in the chair as the sun went down, watching the shadows lengthen across the Ardennes, holding the evidence bag in his hands. The forensic team had released the letter to him that morning. Chain of custody documented, photographs taken, analysis complete. The paper was fragile, the ink faded to a pale brown, but the words were still legible. Dr. Hendricks had offered to have it transcribed, preserved, handled by professionals. Danny had declined. This letter had waited 70 years for his father. Robert Whitmore had died without ever knowing it existed. The least Danny could do was read it himself. He pulled on the nitrile gloves Hendricks had given him and carefully unsealed the bag. The paper was brittle, yellowed at the edges, but the oilcloth wrapping had protected it from the worst of the decay. He unfolded it with trembling fingers. The handwriting was neat but unsteady. The hand that wrote these words had been injured, exhausted, dying. But it had kept writing anyway. November 20th, 1944. My darling boy, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if anyone will ever find me here. But I have to try. I have to believe that somehow, someday, these words will reach you. I'm so sorry, Robert. I'm sorry I won't be there to watch you grow up. I'm sorry I won't see your first day of school, or teach you to ride a bicycle, or hold your hand when you're scared. I wanted all of those things. I wanted them so badly. But I made a choice, and I have to live with it. Or not live with it, I suppose. They're going to tell you I died in an accident, a ferry flight that went wrong. That's not true. I need you to know that's not true. I flew, Robert. I really flew. Not just moving planes from one place to another. I flew missions, combat missions, against the enemy. I can't tell you the details even now. I promised I wouldn't, and even dying, I don't think I can break that promise. But I need you to know that your mother wasn't just a delivery girl in a uniform. I fought, I mattered. There were 5 of us. 5 women who were asked to do something dangerous, something secret, something that would never be acknowledged. We all said yes. We knew the risks. We accepted them. Because someone had to, and we were the ones who could. I've thought a lot about why these past few hours. Sitting here, watching the light fade through the trees. Why did I say yes? Why did I leave you? Part of it was pride, I think. They told me I was one of the best. They told me I could do things no one else could, and I believed them. Maybe that was vanity. Maybe that was ego. But it felt like purpose. It felt like the thing I was born to do. Part of it was duty. There's a war on, and people are dying, and I had skills that could help. How could I say no? How could I stay safe while others were sacrificing everything? But mostly, Robert, it was you. I wanted to build a world where you could grow up free, where you would never have to know what it feels like to live under tyranny, to watch your country burn, to wonder if tomorrow would be your last day. I wanted to give you that world, and if it cost me my life, then at least it would cost something that mattered. I hope you understand. I hope someday when you're old enough, you can forgive me for choosing this. I hope you know that leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done, and that I've thought of you every single day since. I can see the stars now. They're so bright here, brighter than I've ever seen them. I like to think that wherever you are, you're looking at the same stars, that somehow, even though we're apart, we're still connected by that light. Don't let them tell you I was just a ferry pilot, Robert. Don't let them erase what I did. I flew, I fought, I mattered, and I loved you. More than flying, more than freedom, more than anything in this world. Find your own sky, my darling boy. Spread your wings, and know that somewhere, somehow, your mother is watching, and she's so proud of you. All my love, forever, Mama. Danny set the letter down on the desk. He couldn't see any more. His vision had blurred, his eyes burning with tears he couldn't stop. He pressed his palms against his face and let it come. The grief, the rage, the loss that spanned 3 generations. His father had spent 60 years looking for these words. 60 years of letters to the War Department, requests for records, desperate pleas for someone to tell him the truth. And the whole time, this letter had been lying in the Belgian earth, waiting. Robert Whitmore had died believing his mother was a ferry pilot who crashed by accident. He'd never known she was a warrior. He'd never known she chose to fight. He'd never read these words, never felt her love reaching across the decades. The cruelty of it was staggering. Not just that Evelyn had died alone in a foreign forest, but that her sacrifice had been erased. Her own son had been denied the truth. Her memory had been reduced to a telegram and a folded flag, and a story that was never real. Danny wept for a long time. For his grandmother, dying in the cold. For his father, searching in the dark. For himself, standing at the end of a chain of loss that stretched back 70 years. When he finally stopped, the room was dark. The stars were out, bright over the Ardennes hills. He looked up at them through the window and thought of Evelyn, watching these same stars as she wrote her final words. Don't let them tell you I was just a ferry pilot. He wouldn't. He would find out what happened to her. He would find out who sent her here and why they lied and what they were trying to hide. He would bring her story into the light, no matter what it cost. He owed his father that much. He owed her that much. Danny returned to the States with a new focus. The letter had answered one question. Evelyn knew she was part of something secret, something dangerous, something that would be denied. But it raised a dozen more. Who had recruited her? Who were the other 4 women? What was the mission that had killed them all? He went back to the archives, back to the fragmentary OSS records, the redacted memos, the gaps where information should have been. He searched for any reference to female pilots, to special operations involving women, to anything that might connect to what he'd found. 3 days in, he found it. A single mention buried in a declassified index of OSS operational code names. Most entries included brief descriptions, target locations, mission parameters, dates of activity. But one entry was different. Nightingale, September 1944 to December 1944. Personnel, redacted. Objective, redacted. Status, terminated. All records sealed by authority of redacted. Danny stared at the entry. The dates matched perfectly. September 1944, when the 5 women had been recruited. December 1944, when the last of them had died. Operation Nightingale. He searched the index for any other references. Found nothing. The code name appeared once and only once, a ghost in the archive, a shadow of something that had been systematically erased. But the index included one other piece of information. Each entry listed a primary officer, the OSS agent responsible for the operation. For Nightingale, the name was partially visible, the redaction incomplete. Major A. Hollis. Danny cross-referenced the name against OSS personnel records. Major Arthur Hollis, Special Operations Branch. Recruited 1942. Served in London, then France. Awarded the Bronze Star for unspecified actions in 1945. Discharged 1946. And then something unexpected. Hollis had lived until 1987. After the war, he'd worked as a consultant, kept a low profile, never spoke publicly about his service. But when he died, his family had donated his personal papers to a historical archive. The archive was in Alexandria, Virginia, 40 minutes from Danny's apartment. Danny closed his laptop and reached for his phone. He needed to book a research appointment. He needed to see what Arthur Hollis had left behind. Somewhere in those papers, he was certain, lay the truth about Operation Nightingale, the truth about the 5 women who had been recruited, used, and erased, the truth about why his grandmother had died alone in a Belgian forest, holding a letter that would take 70 years to deliver. The Hollis collection was housed in a private historical foundation in Alexandria, a brick building 3 blocks from the Potomac River. Danny arrived on a gray morning, signed the visitor log, and was led to a climate-controlled reading room by an archivist named Mrs. Patterson, who moved with the careful deliberation of someone who had spent 50 years preserving other people's secrets. Major Hollis's family donated his papers in 1989, she explained, setting a stack of acid-free boxes on the table in front of Danny. They were quite extensive. He kept everything. Letters, photographs, operational notes. We've cataloged most of it, but some materials remain restricted. Restricted how? National security classifications. Some of the documents he retained were never officially declassified. We flagged those for review, but the process is slow. She gave Danny a sympathetic look. You're welcome to examine anything that isn't marked. If you need access to restricted materials, you'll have to file a formal request through the appropriate channels. Danny thanked her and waited until she left the room. Then he opened the first box. Arthur Hollis had been meticulous. His papers were organized chronologically, each folder labeled in neat handwriting. Danny worked through them systematically. Training records from 1942, operational reports from London, correspondence with other OSS officers. The picture that emerged was of a competent, dedicated intelligence professional, a man who believed in what he was doing. The second box covered 1944. Danny slowed down, reading more carefully. Hollis had been transferred to France after D-Day, working out of a forward operating base near Lyon. His duties included coordinating supply drops to resistance groups and managing agent networks behind enemy lines. Then, in a folder dated September 1944, Danny found what he was looking for. The tab read, Nightingale, Personnel. Inside were 5 photographs. They were official portraits, the kind taken for military identification. 5 women in flight gear staring at the camera with expressions that ranged from nervous to defiant. Danny recognized his grandmother immediately. Third from the left, dark hair pinned back, eyes steady. She looked younger than he'd imagined, 26 years old, a lifetime ahead of her. Beneath the photographs was a typewritten memo, classified secret, addressed to Hollis from someone identified only as Chief Special Operations. Per our discussion, you are authorized to proceed with recruitment of female pilot assets for Operation Nightingale. Selection criteria: pursuit aircraft qualification, minimum 500 flight hours, psychological stability, no immediate family dependencies. No immediate family dependencies. Danny thought of the 3-year-old boy Evelyn had left behind. Had she lied on her application? Or had someone decided that a young widow with a toddler son didn't count? He kept reading. Hollis's handwritten notes filled in the gaps that the official documents left blank. The concept was audacious. Use female pilots for deniable combat missions over occupied Europe. The logic was coldly pragmatic. German radar operators consistently misidentify aircraft piloted erratically as civilian or inexperienced. Female voices on captured radio transmissions create confusion and uncertainty. If captured, American women flying combat will be dismissed as impossible. Enemy will assume resistance or British auxiliaries. Deniability is built into the operational concept. The women had been transferred quietly, their official records showing continued domestic ferry duty. In reality, they'd been flown to England, then to a hidden airfield in liberated France. They'd been given unmarked P-47s with non-standard paint schemes and told to intercept German supply convoys, disrupt V-2 rocket logistics, provide air support for agent insertions. Danny found mission logs, brief entries, clinical in their detachment. October 10, 1944, Nightingale 3, Whitmore, sortied 0600, target convoy near Sedan. 2 trucks destroyed, no losses. RTB 0845, 17th October, 1944. Nightingale 1, Ellison, and Nightingale 3, Whitmore, sortied 0530, escort mission for Jedburgh team insertion. Mission successful. Minor damage to Nightingale 1 aircraft, October 28, 1944. Nightingale 2, Brennan, failed to return from interdiction mission near Bastogne. No distress call received. Status: missing. The entries continued through November. One by one, the women disappeared. Brennan, then Ellison, then Carver. The clinical language couldn't hide what was happening, a small unit being ground down by attrition, losing pilots faster than any sustainable operation should. Then, on November 20th, the entry Danny had been dreading. November 20th, 1944. Nightingale 3, Whitmore, sortied 0545, target V-2 component convoy near Vielsalm. Initial strike successful, 3 vehicles destroyed. Nightingale 3 reported engine damage from ground fire, attempting emergency landing. No further contact. Status: missing. That was it. No search, no investigation. No follow-up entry recording what had happened to her. Danny turned the page and found something worse. A memorandum dated December 15, 1944. The header was partially redacted, but the originating office was visible. OSS Headquarters, Washington. The signature at the bottom was blacked out, but the text was clear. Effective immediately, Operation Nightingale is terminated. All personnel files are to be sealed. All operational records are to be destroyed or transferred to classified archive. Nightingale assets who fail to return are to be listed in official records as training accidents or ferry losses per attached cover stories. No investigation into missing personnel is authorized. No recovery operations are to be conducted. Rationale: congressional oversight of OSS operations is increasing. Discovery of Nightingale would create unacceptable political liability. Program never received formal authorization from War Department. Exposure would compromise ongoing operations and damage relations with Allied services. All personnel with knowledge of Nightingale are reminded of their secrecy obligations. Violation will be treated as treason. Danny read the memorandum 3 times. His hands had gone cold. They knew. When Evelyn went down, they knew approximately where. They'd received her last transmission. They could have searched for her, could have coordinated with resistance forces, could have at least tried to bring her home. Instead, they'd written her off. They'd classified her death as a ferry accident, sent a false telegram to her family, and buried the truth so deep that even 70 years of searching couldn't find it. The betrayal wasn't German. It wasn't enemy action. It was American. Her own country had abandoned her, then lied about it for 7 decades. Danny photographed every document. His hands were shaking, but he forced himself to work methodically. Each page, each memo, each damning piece of evidence. When he was finished, he returned the materials to their boxes exactly as he'd found them. He was gathering his things when he noticed the man, sitting at a table across the reading room. Gray suit, thinning hair, reading glasses perched on his nose. He looked like any other researcher, except he wasn't researching anything. The book open in front of him hadn't had its pages turned in the 2 hours Danny had been working, and twice, when Danny looked up suddenly, he'd caught the man watching him. Danny packed his bag slowly, walked to the exit at a normal pace. Didn't look back. Outside, the gray morning had turned to gray afternoon. Danny crossed the street and stopped at a coffee shop on the corner, taking a seat by the window where he could watch the archive entrance. 5 minutes later, the man in the gray suit emerged. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up and down the street. Then he pulled out a phone and made a call. Danny watched him talk, watched his eyes scan the area, watched him hang up and walk to a black sedan parked half a block away. The sedan had been there when Danny arrived that morning. He was certain of it. Someone knew he was digging. Someone was watching. Danny finished his coffee and left through the back entrance. He took a circuitous route to his car, doubling back twice to check for followers. The paranoia felt excessive, ridiculous. He was an OSI agent investigating a 70-year-old case, not a spy in enemy territory. But Evelyn had been erased. 5 women had been erased. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to keep Nightingale secret, and that someone might still have reasons to keep it buried. Danny drove home with one eye on the rearview mirror. He had the evidence now. He knew what happened and why it had been covered up, but he still didn't know who had given the order. The memorandum signature was redacted. The Chief Special Operations was a title, not a name. Someone had authorized Nightingale. Someone had terminated it. Someone had decided that 5 women's lives were worth less than political convenience. Danny intended to find out who. Danny found William Price through the kind of methodical detective work that had defined his career. He started with Hollis's notes. The major had been careful, but not careful enough. Scattered throughout his operational records were references to a Colonel P. who had overseen Nightingale's security protocols. The colonel had visited the forward operating base in France twice, reviewed pilot performance, and ultimately recommended the program's termination after losses became unsustainable. Cross-referencing OSS personnel rosters from late 1944 wasn't easy. Many records had been destroyed or remained classified. But Danny had access to databases that civilian researchers didn't, and he knew how to work the system. Within a week, he had narrowed the field to 3 possibilities. 2 were dead. Colonel Patrick Moran, heart attack in 1978. Colonel Peter Whitfield, car accident in 1962. The third was William Price. Colonel William Price, OSS, Special Operations, 1943 to 1945. Bronze Star, Legion of Merit. After the war, he'd transitioned seamlessly into the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, where he'd served until 1975. 3 decades of classified service, followed by a quiet retirement. No memoirs, no interviews, no public acknowledgement of what he'd done during the war. He was 94 years old, living in a retirement community called Maple Grove in Fairfax, Virginia, 30 minutes from Danny's apartment. Danny considered calling ahead, requesting an interview through official channels, following the protocols that governed how federal agents interacted with elderly civilians. Instead, he drove to Maple Grove on a Saturday morning and walked through the front door. The facility was nice, not luxurious but comfortable. Clean hallways, cheerful staff, the faint smell of disinfectant masked by air freshener. Danny signed in at the front desk, showed his credentials, and asked to see William Price. The receptionist made a call. A few minutes later, a nurse led Danny down a corridor lined with photographs of smiling residents and inspirational quotes about aging gracefully. Price's room was at the end of the hall. The nurse knocked, waited for a response, then opened the door and stepped aside. "Mr. Price, you have a visitor?" Danny walked in. The room was small but personal, a hospital bed, neatly made, a recliner by the window, bookshelves filled with hardcovers, history mostly, military history, and photographs. Dozens of them, covering every available surface. William Price sat in the recliner, a blanket over his legs, despite the warmth of the room. He was thin, shrunken with age, his skin papery and spotted, but his eyes were sharp. They tracked Danny as he entered, assessed him, calculated. Those were not the eyes of a man whose mind had faded. "Special Agent Daniel Whitmore," Price said. His voice was reedy but clear. "OSI. I wondered when you'd come." Danny stopped in the middle of the room. "You know who I am?" "I know who your grandmother was." Price gestured to a chair near the window. "Sit down. We have a lot to discuss." Danny sat. He studied the old man's face, looking for guilt, defiance, fear. He found only a weary resignation, the expression of someone who had been carrying a weight for a very long time and was almost relieved to set it down. "How did you know I was coming?" "I still have friends in certain places. They told me someone was asking questions about Nightingale, pulling records, visiting archives." Price's lips twitched. Not quite a smile. "I've been expecting this for 70 years, ever since we shut the program down. I knew eventually someone would find out." "And you just waited?" "What else could I do? The files were sealed. The witnesses were dead or sworn to silence. I thought, we all thought, that it would stay buried forever." He shook his head slowly. "But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially the ones we try hardest to hide." Danny leaned forward. "Tell me about Operation Nightingale." Price was quiet for a long moment. His gaze drifted to the window, to the manicured grounds outside, to something only he could see. "It was Hollis's idea originally," he said finally. "Arthur Hollis, brilliant man, unconventional thinker. He came to me in the summer of '44 with this proposal: use female pilots for deniable combat missions. The logic was sound. Women were invisible in that context. The enemy wouldn't believe it. If something went wrong, we could disavow everything. And you approved it." "I recommended approval. The final authority came from higher up." Price's jaw tightened. "We recruited 5 women, the best pilots we could find. Volunteers, all of them. We explained the risks. We explained that if they were captured, we couldn't acknowledge them. They understood. They accepted." "Did they understand that if they died, their families would be lied to? That their service would be erased?" Price met Danny's eyes. "Yes, they understood. That was the price of the mission. They paid it willingly." Danny felt his hands clench. "My grandmother left behind a 3-year-old son. He spent 60 years trying to find out what happened to her. He wrote letters, filed requests, begged anyone who would listen, and the whole time you knew she was a hero, and you let him believe she was nothing." "I let him believe she died serving her country." Price's voice hardened. "Which she did. The details were classified. They had to be classified. Do you have any idea what would have happened if the truth came out?" "Tell me." "Disaster. Complete disaster." Price shifted in his chair, agitation breaking through his careful composure. "Congress was already suspicious of the OSS. They thought we were cowboys, operating without oversight, spending money without accountability. If they'd discovered we were sending women into combat, unauthorized, off the books, they would have shut us down. Not just Nightingale, the entire organization." "So you protected the institution?" "I protected the mission. We were fighting a war, a real war, against an enemy that wanted to enslave the world. Every decision we made, every sacrifice we demanded was in service of winning that war. Your grandmother understood that. She believed in it." Danny stood up. He couldn't sit anymore, couldn't contain the anger that was building in his chest. He walked to the window, stared out at the nothing beyond. "You could have found her," he said quietly. "After she went down. You received her last transmission. You knew approximately where she was. You could have sent a search party, coordinated with the resistance." "We couldn't." Price's voice was flat. The Battle of the Bulge started 3 weeks later. The entire region was overrun by German forces. Even if we'd wanted to search, it would have been impossible. Before the offensive, there were 3 weeks. Silence. Danny turned back to face him. "You had 3 weeks. You could have tried." Price looked away. For the first time, something that might have been shame crossed his face. "The decision was made to cut our losses. Nightingale was compromised. Too many casualties, too much risk of exposure. The order came down to terminate the program and bury the records. No recovery operations, no investigations." He paused. "I didn't agree with it, for what that's worth. I argued that we owed those women more, but I was overruled." "By who?" Price hesitated. "By who?" Danny repeated. "Who gave the termination order?" "I can't—" The old man stopped. His hands were trembling slightly, whether from age or emotion Danny couldn't tell. "I've kept this secret for 70 years. I took an oath. Those women took an oath, too, to serve their country, and their country abandoned them." Danny crossed the room, stood directly in front of Price's chair. "My father died without knowing the truth. He spent his whole life searching for answers that you could have given him. You owe me a name." Price looked up at him. For a long moment, neither man spoke. Then the old man's shoulders sagged. The last of his resistance crumbled. "Hartwell," he said quietly. "General Richard Hartwell. He was Deputy Director of Special Operations in '44. He's the one who authorized Nightingale's termination. He's the one who ordered the cover-up." Danny didn't recognize the name. "Is he still alive?" "No, died in 1991, but he went on to have quite a career after the war. CIA, mostly. Deputy Director of Operations in the '60s. Price smiled bitterly. He was considered a hero, a patriot. They named a conference room after him at Langley. And his records? Classified. Most of what Hartwell touched is still classified. You'd need CIA authorization to access any of it. Price shook his head. "I'm sorry. I know that's not what you want to hear, but some doors aren't meant to be opened, not even after 70 years. Danny stared at him. This frail old man, keeper of secrets, functionary of a system that had swallowed his grandmother whole. "You were just following orders," Danny said. "Is that what you want me to believe?" Price flinched as if he'd been struck. "I was a soldier. We all were. We did what we thought was right. My grandmother died alone in a forest, writing a letter to a son she'd never see again. My father grew up without a mother, spent his entire life haunted by questions no one would answer. And you sat here for 70 years, knowing the truth, saying nothing." Danny's voice was steady, but cold. "That's not following orders. That's cowardice." He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. "I'm going to find out everything," he said without turning around. "I'm going to get those records declassified. I'm going to tell the world what happened to those women, and when I do, everyone will know what you did, what you allowed." He heard Price's voice behind him, thin and tired. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, Agent Whitmore. She was brave and skilled, and she believed in what she was doing. I want you to know that. Whatever else you think of me, I want you to know that I respected her. I respected all of them." Danny didn't respond. He walked out of the room, down the corridor, past the cheerful photographs and inspirational quotes, out into the cold Virginia morning. He had a name now, General Richard Hartwell, a dead man with classified records and a conference room at Langley. Price was right about one thing. Some doors weren't meant to be opened. Danny intended to open them anyway. Getting access to CIA historical files was like trying to pick a lock with a sledgehammer. Danny spent 3 weeks working the system. He filed FOIA requests, citing his status as next of kin to a service member whose records had been improperly classified. He contacted the CIA's Historical Review Program, requesting expedited review of materials related to OSS operations in 1944. He called in favors from colleagues who had connections to the intelligence community, asked friends at the Pentagon to make inquiries on his behalf. Most of his requests disappeared into bureaucratic silence. Form letters arrived acknowledging receipt and promising review within 12 to 18 months. One inquiry was rejected outright. The materials he'd requested were exempt from disclosure under national security provisions. But Danny had spent 16 years investigating people who didn't want to be investigated. He knew how to be persistent. He knew how to find the cracks in institutional walls. The crack, when it came, arrived in the form of a retired CIA historian named Margaret Chen. Dr. Chen had spent 30 years working in the agency's history staff before retiring in 2010. She'd written extensively about OSS operations, published several books on wartime intelligence, and maintained contacts throughout the intelligence community. When Danny's inquiries reached her through a mutual acquaintance, she agreed to meet. They sat in a coffee shop in Georgetown, surrounded by college students and tourists. Dr. Chen was in her 70s, sharp-eyed and skeptical, the kind of woman who had survived decades in a male-dominated profession by being smarter and tougher than everyone around her. Danny told her everything: his grandmother, the crash site, Nightingale, the cover-up. Chen listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "I've heard of Nightingale," she said finally. "Rumors, mostly, references and documents that were redacted before I could see them. I always suspected there was something there, but I could never prove it." "Can you help me get access to the records?" Chen stirred her coffee slowly. "The Hartwell files are sensitive, not because of what he did during the war. Most of that has been declassified over the years, but because of what he did after." "What do you mean?" "Richard Hartwell was involved in some of the agency's most controversial operations in the 50s and 60s, Guatemala, Iran, Cuba. The people who control those files are very protective." She met Danny's eyes. "But there might be a way." Hartwell kept personal papers, diaries, correspondence, operational notes. When he died, his family donated some of them to the National Archives. The donation was incomplete. Certain materials were retained by the agency for security review. And the security review was completed 15 years ago. The materials were cleared for release, but never actually transferred. Chen smiled thinly. "Bureaucratic oversight. It happens more often than you'd think. The files are sitting in a warehouse in Maryland, waiting for someone to ask for them." She wrote an address on a napkin and slid it across the table. "I'll make some calls. Tell them you're coming." The warehouse was in Suitland, Maryland, a nondescript facility surrounded by chain-link fence and security cameras. Danny arrived with his credentials, a letter from Dr. Chen, and the persistent feeling that he was being watched. The materials were stored in 3 archival boxes labeled with Hartwell's name and a classification code that had been crossed out and replaced with Declassified, 2009. Danny signed for them, carried them to a reading room, and began to work. The first box contained personal correspondence, letters to family, notes from colleagues, the mundane paperwork of a long career. Danny skimmed through it quickly, looking for anything related to 1944. The second box was more promising. Operational files, heavily annotated in Hartwell's handwriting, reports on agent networks in France, assessments of resistance capabilities, planning documents for missions that had been classified for decades. And then, near the bottom of the box, a folder marked Nightingale. Final assessment. Danny's hands trembled as he opened it. The document inside was dated December 20th, 1944, 5 days after the termination order. It was Hartwell's personal summary of the program, written for his own records rather than official channels. Nightingale achieved all operational objectives. 5 pilots conducted 23 successful missions over a 3-month period, destroying an estimated 47 enemy vehicles and disrupting V-2 logistics in the target area. Pilot performance exceeded expectations. The operational concept, using female pilots for deniable combat missions, proved sound. However, the program is not sustainable. Casualty rates are unacceptable, 100% over the operational period. Security has been compromised by the loss of multiple aircraft in enemy-controlled territory. Congressional inquiries into OSS activities are increasing. Discovery of Nightingale would be catastrophic. Recommendation: terminate program immediately. Seal all records. Provide cover stories for deceased personnel consistent with training accidents or ferry losses. Deny all knowledge if questioned. Personal note: I am aware that this decision will cause pain to the families of the pilots involved. That pain is regrettable, but necessary. The security of ongoing operations must take precedence over individual considerations. These women knew the risks when they volunteered. They would understand. Danny read the last paragraph 3 times, the casual dismissal, the assumption that his grandmother would have accepted her own erasure as necessary. The arrogance of a man who had never spent 60 years wondering what happened to his mother. He kept searching. Near the back of the folder, he found a document that stopped his breath. It was a signals intelligence log, a transcript of radio communications from November 20th, 1944, the day Evelyn went down. 0547, Nightingale. 3 reports: visual contact with target convoy, grid reference, redacted. Beginning attack run. 0552. Nightingale, 3 reports, 2 vehicles destroyed. Taking ground fire. 0554. Nightingale, 3 reports, engine damage. Fuel pressure dropping. Attempting emergency landing. 0556. Nightingale, 3. Engines failing. I'm going down. Grid reference approximately. Redacted. Tell my boy I love him. 0558. No further contact. Nightingale, 3, presumed down. Danny stared at the page, his vision blurred. Tell my boy I love him. Her last words. Transmitted over military radio, received by someone sitting at a communication station, transcribed onto this piece of paper. And then buried, filed away in a classified folder, never shared with her family, never acknowledged. They had heard her. They knew her last thoughts were of her son, and they had chosen to pretend she never existed. Danny turned the page. There was one more document, a memorandum dated November 22nd, 1944, 2 days after Evelyn went down. From Chief Special Operations to Nightingale. Operations Officer. Subject: Recovery Operations. Request for recovery operation and grid reference, redacted, is denied. Current tactical situation does not permit diversion of resources. Additionally, exposure of Nightingale assets to recovery teams would compromise program security. Nightingale 3 is to be listed as lost during ferry transit. Cover story attached. No further action required. They could have found her. The grid reference was approximate, but accurate enough. Resistance forces operated throughout the region. A coordinated search might have located the crash site within days. Instead, they had written her off. Not because recovery was impossible, but because it was inconvenient. Because finding her body might have raised questions. Because it was easier to let the forest swallow her than to explain what she was doing there. Danny sat in the silence of the reading room for a long time. He thought about his grandmother, dying alone in the cold, writing a letter that would take 70 years to deliver. He thought about his father, spending his entire adult life searching for answers that had been locked in a warehouse in Maryland. He thought about the men who had made these decisions, Hartwell, Price, others whose names he would never know, and how they had lived out their careers and died in their beds, honored and respected, while 5 women rotted in unmarked graves. The injustice of it was staggering, not just that they had died, but that their deaths had been stolen from them, their sacrifice erased, their families denied even the comfort of knowing the truth. Danny photographed every document. Then he sat back and considered his options. He could file official complaints, request formal investigations, work through channels, follow procedures, let the system process his findings at its own glacial pace. Or he could do what his grandmother had done, take a risk, make a choice, force the truth into the light, regardless of the consequences. The system had failed Evelyn Whitmore. It had failed her son. It had failed Danny's entire family for 3 generations. Danny was done trusting the system. He pulled out his phone and searched for a number he'd saved weeks ago, a journalist at the Washington Post who specialized in military history. They'd exchanged emails when Danny first started his research, and she'd expressed interest in the story. He typed a message. "I have documents. World War II cover-up involving female combat pilots, classified for 70 years. Ready to go on the record." The response came within minutes. "When can we meet?" Danny looked at the photograph of Evelyn in his phone, her steady eyes, her quiet smile. "Don't let them tell you I was just a ferry pilot." He typed his reply, "Tomorrow." The story broke on a Tuesday morning in October. Danny had spent 3 months working with Sarah Kessler, the Post journalist, preparing the piece. They'd verified every document, cross-referenced every claim, consulted historians and legal experts to ensure the story was bulletproof. The Post's lawyers had reviewed everything twice. No one wanted to accuse the U.S. government of a 70-year cover-up without ironclad evidence. The evidence was ironclad. The headline ran across the front page. "Secret WWI program sent women into combat." Then erased them. Below it, 5 photographs, 5 women in flight gear, staring at the camera with eyes that had seen the future and accepted it. Evelyn was in the center. The story laid out everything. Operation Nightingale, the recruitment of female pilots for deniable combat missions, the systematic cover-up after their deaths, the false telegrams sent to families, the records sealed for 7 decades, and the discovery in a Belgian forest of a woman who had been abandoned by her own country. Danny's phone started ringing at 6 a.m. and didn't stop. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, the story had been picked up by every major news outlet in the country. Cable news ran segments with historians and military analysts debating the implications. Veterans organizations issued statements demanding accountability. Social media erupted with outrage, admiration, and disbelief. The Air Force's initial response was predictable. A spokesperson issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging that historical records from the World War II era may contain inconsistencies and promising a thorough review of the materials in question. It was bureaucratic deflection designed to buy time and hope. The story faded. The story didn't fade. 3 days after the Post article, Danny received a phone call from a woman named Patricia Brennan Coyle. She was 72 years old, living in Ohio. Her grandmother was Dorothy Brennan, Nightingale II, officially lost over the Gulf of Mexico in November 1944. "My mother spent her whole life believing Grandma died in an accident," Patricia said, her voice cracking. "She used to talk about how she wished she knew what happened. She died 8 years ago, still wondering." A pause. "Is it true? Was my grandmother a combat pilot?" Danny told her it was true. He told her everything he knew about Dorothy Brennan, the missions she'd flown, the targets she'd destroyed, the last entry in Hollis's log before she disappeared. He told her that Dorothy had been a hero and that her country had betrayed her. Patricia wept on the phone. Then she asked how she could help. Within a week, Danny had been contacted by descendants of all 5 Nightingale pilots. Grandchildren, great-grandchildren, cousins, families who had lived for decades with unanswered questions and official lies. They formed an unlikely coalition, united by grief and anger and a determination to see their ancestors honored. They hired lawyers. They filed formal complaints with the Department of Defense. They gave interviews to anyone who would listen. The pressure mounted. 2 weeks after the story broke, Danny received a call from the Pentagon. The meeting took place in a conference room at the Air Force History and Museums Program headquarters in Washington. Danny sat on one side of the table with Patricia Brennan Coyle and representatives from the other families. On the other side sat a brigadier general named Harrison, flanked by lawyers and public affairs officers. General Harrison was in his 50s, with silver hair and the measured demeanor of a career officer who had learned to navigate political minefields. He began with an apology. "On behalf of the United States Air Force, I want to express our deepest regret for the pain this situation has caused your families," he said. The decisions made in 1944 were made in a different time, under different circumstances. That doesn't excuse them. It doesn't make them right. But I hope you can understand that the men involved believed they were acting in the best interests of national security. Danny had heard this argument before, from Price, from the documents he'd uncovered. The eternal refuge of institutions caught in wrongdoing. We meant well. With respect, General, Danny said, understanding why they did it doesn't change what they did. 5 women were erased. Their families were lied to for 70 years. We're not here to understand. We're here to fix it. Harrison nodded slowly. What would fixing it look like to you? Danny had prepared for this question. He slid a document across the table, a list of demands the families had agreed upon. First, full declassification of all records related to Operation Nightingale. No more redactions, no more sealed files. The complete truth available to anyone who wants to see it. Harrison glanced at his lawyers. One of them made a note. Second, official acknowledgement of these women's service, not as ferry pilots, not as training accidents, as combat veterans who flew missions against enemy forces and died in service to their country. That may require congressional action, Harrison said. The WASP weren't granted veteran status until 1977. Changing their individual records, then start the process. We'll wait. Harrison's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Third, Danny continued, military funerals with full honors for all 5 women, proper burials in national cemeteries, headstones that tell the truth about who they were and what they did. That can be arranged. And finally, Danny paused. This was the one he cared about most. A formal apology, not a press release, not a statement from a spokesperson. A public ceremony with families present where the Air Force acknowledges what was done and asks forgiveness. The room was silent. Harrison studied Danny's face for a long moment. You understand that an apology of that nature would be unprecedented. It would require approval from the highest levels. Then get approval. Danny leaned forward. My grandmother died alone in a forest, writing a letter to a son she'd never see again. My father spent 60 years searching for answers that were locked in a filing cabinet. He died without ever knowing his mother was a hero. You can't give him that knowledge back. You can't undo what was done, but you can acknowledge it. You can say publicly that these women mattered, that their sacrifice was real, that the lie was wrong. Harrison was quiet for a long time. The lawyers whispered among themselves. The public affairs officers exchanged glances. Finally, the general nodded. I'll take it to the secretary, he said. I can't promise anything, but I'll advocate for everything you've asked. It wasn't a victory, not yet, but it was a beginning. Danny visited Price one more time. The retirement facility was quieter than before. Autumn had arrived, and the trees outside were shedding their leaves, carpeting the grounds in red and gold. Danny walked the familiar hallway, past the photographs and inspirational quotes, to the room at the end. Price looked worse, thinner, frailer. The blanket over his legs seemed to swallow him. An oxygen tube ran to his nose, and his breathing was labored, but his eyes were still sharp. They tracked Danny as he entered, assessed him, calculated. I saw the news, Price said. His voice was a whisper now, barely audible above the hum of medical equipment. You did it. You got them to listen. Danny sat in the chair by the window, the same chair he'd used months ago when he'd come here demanding answers. The Air Force is going to acknowledge Nightingale. Full disclosure. Military honors. An apology. Price nodded slowly. Good. That's good. Is it? Danny studied the old man's face. Does it matter to you, after 70 years of silence? Price was quiet for a long moment. His gaze drifted to the window, to the falling leaves, to something beyond. I've thought about those women every day since 1944, he said finally. Every single day. I told myself we did what we had to do, that the secrecy was necessary, that they would have understood. He paused. But I never really believed it. Not completely. There was always a part of me that knew we were wrong, that we owed them more than silence. Then why didn't you speak up? You had 70 years. You could have told the truth at any time. And what would have happened? Price turned to face him. I would have been prosecuted for violating my security oath. The story would have been denied, discredited. I would have died in prison, and nothing would have changed. He shook his head. I was a coward, I know that. I chose my own comfort over their memory. But I also knew that the truth would come out eventually. Secrets always do. I hoped I wouldn't be alive to see it. Danny felt something shift in his chest. Not forgiveness, he wasn't capable of that. Not yet, maybe not ever. But something like understanding. Price was a man who had made a choice in 1944 and spent the rest of his life living with its consequences. He wasn't a monster. He was something worse. He was ordinary. My father died without knowing, Danny said quietly. He spent his whole life searching for his mother. 60 years of letters and phone calls and dead ends. And the whole time you knew. You could have told him. You could have given him peace. Price closed his eyes. A tear tracked down his weathered cheek. I know, he whispered. I know, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Danny watched him for a long moment. This frail old man, crying in his chair, carrying a weight that had crushed him so slowly he hadn't even noticed. She wrote him a letter, Danny said. Before she died. We found it with her remains. She told him she loved him. She told him not to let anyone erase what she did. Price's eyes opened. Did your father ever see it? No. He died 16 years before we found her. Danny's voice was steady, but something cracked beneath the surface. The letter waited 70 years in the Belgian earth, and it still arrived too late. Price had no response to that. There was no response. Some wounds were too deep to heal, some losses too complete to recover. Danny stood up. The funeral is in 3 weeks, he said. Arlington National Cemetery. Full military honors. You're not invited. He walked to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame, just as he had months ago. I hope you live long enough to see her headstone, he said without turning around. I hope you see her name and her rank and the truth about what she did. And I hope you think about my father, who never got to see any of it. He left without waiting for a response. Behind him, in the quiet room, William Price wept. The preparations took weeks. Evelyn's remains had been officially identified, processed, and prepared for burial. The paperwork alone was a nightmare. She had never been officially stationed in Belgium, never officially flown combat missions, never officially died in the way she actually died. Every form, every document, every bureaucratic requirement had to be adapted to accommodate a truth that the system had never been designed to acknowledge. But slowly, inexorably, it came together. The Air Force approved the ceremony. The Secretary himself would attend. The other Nightingale families would be present, united for the first time since their grandmothers had flown together 80 years ago. Danny spent the night before the funeral in his apartment, alone with the box of his father's papers. He read through the letters again. All those requests, all those inquiries, all those desperate attempts to find answers. Robert Whitmore had never stopped searching. Even in his final years, even when his health was failing and his hope was fading, he had kept writing letters, kept asking questions. At the bottom of the box, Danny found something he'd missed before. A birthday card dated 1952. Robert would have been 11 years old. The card was addressed to Mama. Inside, in a child's careful handwriting, was a simple message: Happy birthday in heaven. I miss you. I hope you can see me from up there. I'm trying to be good. Love. Robert Danny held the card for a long time. His father at 11, writing to a mother he barely remembered, sending words into the void, hoping somehow they would reach her. Tomorrow Danny would stand at Evelyn's grave and read her letter aloud. The words she had written, dying in a forest, would finally reach their destination. 70 years late, delivered to the wrong generation, but delivered nonetheless. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. The morning of the funeral dawned cold and bright. Arlington National Cemetery stretched across the Virginia hills in perfect geometric rows, white headstones marking the final rest of men and women who had given everything for their country. Danny had been here before, for colleagues, for friends, for the quiet rituals of military grief that marked the end of service, but he had never stood here as family. The ceremony was scheduled for 11 o'clock. Danny arrived at 9, needing the silence, needing the space to prepare for what was coming. He walked the paths alone, past graves dating back to the Civil War, past monuments to wars his grandmother had never lived to see. The air smelled of cut grass and autumn leaves, and somewhere in the distance a bugler was practicing, the notes drifting across the hills like ghosts. Evelyn's plot was in Section 60, among the newer graves, the ones that held the wars of Danny's own lifetime. It had taken considerable negotiation to secure the location. Technically, she should have been placed in an older section with other World War II veterans. But Danny had argued, and the families had argued, and eventually the Army had relented. Evelyn Whitmore would rest among heroes of every generation, her sacrifice finally acknowledged alongside theirs. The grave was open, waiting. A small canopy had been erected nearby, white chairs arranged in rows for the mourners who would soon arrive. An honor guard stood at attention, 7 airmen in dress blues, rifles at their sides. Danny stood at the edge of the grave and looked down into the earth. Somewhere beneath this Virginia soil, his grandmother would finally come home. 80 years after she had kissed her son goodbye. 70 years after she had bled out in a Belgian forest. 16 years after Robert Whitmore had died still searching. "I found you," Danny said quietly. "I'm sorry it took so long." The mourners began arriving at 10:30. Patricia Brennan Coyle came first, accompanied by her daughter and 2 grandchildren. Then the Ellison family, 3 generations who had driven through the night from Michigan. The Carvers, the Dolls, descendants of women who had flown together, died together, and been erased together. United now, at last, in remembrance. Henri Caron had flown in from Belgium. 86 years old, frail but determined, he walked with a cane and the careful dignity of a man fulfilling a sacred obligation. When he saw Danny, he embraced him without words. "My father would be honored," Henry said finally, "to see her receive what she deserved." Military officials arrived next. The Secretary of the Air Force, flanked by aides and generals. A congressional delegation, including 2 senators who had championed the declassification effort. Journalists with cameras and notebooks kept at a respectful distance by protocol officers. And historians, Dr. Catherine Shaw from Texas Woman's University, Dr. Margaret Chen, who had helped Danny unlock the CIA archives, others who had spent their careers studying the WASP, who had suspected for years that something had been hidden, and who had come to witness the truth finally acknowledged. By 11 o'clock, every seat was filled. The crowd spilled beyond the canopy, standing on the grass, lining the path that led to the grave. More people than Danny had expected, more than he had dared to hope. The honor guard called the assembly to attention. The ceremony began with the national anthem, sung by a young airman whose voice carried clear and strong across the silent cemetery. Then the chaplain spoke, words about sacrifice, about service, about the debt owed to those who give their lives for their country. Danny barely heard any of it. His eyes were fixed on the flag-draped casket that had been carried to the graveside, the simple wooden box that held what remained of Evelyn Whitmore. She had been so young, 26 years old, a lifetime ahead of her, stolen by a war and buried by a lie. The Secretary of the Air Force rose to speak. His remarks were careful, measured, approved by lawyers and public affairs officers. But beneath the bureaucratic caution, there was something genuine. Evelyn Whitmore was a pioneer, he said. She was one of the first women to fly combat missions for the United States military, at a time when such service was deemed impossible, inappropriate, unthinkable. She volunteered for a dangerous assignment, knowing the risks, knowing that if she fell, her sacrifice might never be acknowledged. She gave her life for her country, and her country failed her. He paused. The cemetery was utterly silent. Today, we begin to correct that failure. Today, we acknowledge what Evelyn Whitmore and her fellow pilots accomplished. We honor their courage, their skill, their dedication. And we apologize, formally, publicly, and without reservation, for the decades of silence that denied them the recognition they deserved. He turned to face the families directly. To the descendants of the Nightingale pilots, we are sorry. We cannot undo what was done. We cannot give you back the years of wondering, the unanswered questions, the grief compounded by secrecy. But we can promise that from this day forward, the truth will be told. These women will be remembered. Their names will not be forgotten. Danny felt tears on his face. He didn't wipe them away. When the official remarks concluded, Danny rose to speak. He hadn't prepared a speech. He had tried, in the days leading up to the funeral, to write something appropriate, something that captured who his grandmother was, what her loss had meant, why this moment mattered. But every draft had felt hollow, inadequate. In the end, he had decided to let Evelyn speak for herself. He walked to the podium and unfolded the letter. The original was too fragile to handle. He held a copy, but the words were hers, unchanged across 8 decades. My grandmother wrote this letter on November 20th, 1944, Danny said. She was dying in a forest in Belgium, alone, 4,000 miles from home. She had been shot down during a combat mission that her own country would deny for 70 years. She knew she would never see her son again, and with her last strength, she wrote to him. He looked out at the assembled mourners. Patricia Brennan Coyle was weeping openly. Henri Caron sat with his hands folded, his weathered face solemn. The generals and politicians watched with expressions Danny couldn't read. My father never received this letter. He spent 60 years searching for answers about his mother, and he died without finding them. He never knew she was a combat pilot. He never knew she was a hero. He never knew how much she loved him. Danny's voice cracked. He steadied himself against the podium. I'm going to read her words now, not for the history books, not for the official record, for my father, Robert Whitmore, who should have heard them a lifetime ago. He began to read. My darling boy, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't know if anyone will ever find me here, but I have to try. The words carried across the silent cemetery. Evelyn's voice reaching through time, finally delivering the message she had died trying to send. Danny read about her choice, her reasons, her hope that her son would understand. He read about the 5 women who had volunteered together, who had flown together, who had accepted risks that no one would ever acknowledge. He read about love that transcended death, about sacrifice that demanded remembrance. When he reached the final lines, his voice was barely a whisper. Don't let them tell you I was just a ferry pilot, Robert. Don't let them erase what I did. I flew, I fought, I mattered, and I loved you, more than flying, more than freedom, more than anything in this world. He looked up from the letter. Find your own sky, my darling boy. Spread your wings, and know that somewhere, somehow, your mother is watching, and she's so proud of you. Danny folded the letter carefully. She's home now, Dad, he said quietly. I brought her home. The honor guard raised their rifles. 3 volleys echoed across the hills, sharp and final, the traditional salute to the fallen. Then the bugler played taps. The notes hung in the cold air, each one a separate grief, a separate loss. Danny stood at attention, tears streaming down his face, as the flag was lifted from his grandmother's casket and folded with precise, reverent movements. The honor guard commander knelt before him, presenting the triangle of stars and stripes. On behalf of the President of the United States Air Force, and a grateful nation, please accept this flag as a symbol of our appreciation for your grandmother's honorable and faithful service. Danny took the flag. It was heavier than he expected, weighted with 80 years of silence finally broken. The casket was lowered into the earth. Afterward, Danny stood alone at the grave. The mourners had offered their condolences and drifted away. The officials had departed in their motorcades. The journalists had gotten their footage and their quotes. Even Henri Caron had returned to his hotel, exhausted by the journey and the emotion. Danny remained. He held 2 objects in his hands. The first was the photograph. Evelyn in her flight suit, squinting into the sun, looking like she was about to laugh. The photograph his father had kept in a shoebox for 60 years. The only image of her that Robert had ever possessed. The second was a set of dog tags. Not Evelyn's, those had been buried with her, returned at last to their owner. These tags belonged to Robert Whitmore, issued during his service in Korea, worn through 3 years of war, and kept in a drawer for the rest of his life. Danny knelt at the edge of the grave. "I wish you could have been here," he said. "Both of you. I wish you could have met, really met, the way you were supposed to, mother and son, instead of—" His voice broke. "Instead of this?" He placed the photograph against the temporary marker that would stand until the headstone was installed. Then he pressed his father's dog tags into the fresh earth beside it. "You're together now," he whispered. "Finally, after all this time." He stayed there for a long while, kneeling in the grass, watching the shadows lengthen across the white stones. The sun moved westward, painting the hills in gold and amber. Eventually, he rose. The headstone would be installed in 3 weeks. He had approved the inscription himself after long discussions with the military and the other families. It would read, "Evelyn Margaret Whitmore, Women Air Force Service Pilots, Office of Strategic Services, Operation Nightingale, 1918 to 1944. She flew, she fought, she mattered, not the standard military epitaph, not the regulation format, but the truth." Finally, after 80 years, the truth. Danny returned to work the following Monday. His desk was piled with files that had accumulated during his weeks of leave. Fraud cases, misconduct investigations, the routine work of military justice. His colleagues welcomed him back with awkward condolences and careful questions about the funeral. He answered briefly, deflected politely, settled back into the rhythm of his job. But something had changed. On his wall, beside his credentials and commendations, Danny had hung a new photograph. Evelyn in her flight gear, standing beside her P-47, smiling at the camera. Below it, he had placed a small frame containing her compass, the one Henry's father had kept for 70 years, the one that had guided her across occupied Europe on her final mission. He looked at them sometimes, between cases, between phone calls, between the small bureaucratic tasks that filled his days. His grandmother, watching over him. Her compass still pointing the way. The investigation had consumed nearly a year of his life. It had cost him sleep, sanity, relationships. It had forced him to confront truths about his family, his country, and himself that he could never unknow. And in the end, what had he accomplished? Evelyn was still dead. His father was still dead. The men who had ordered the cover-up were still dead, beyond any earthly justice. The system that had erased 5 women had acknowledged its failure, apologized for its sins, and continued functioning exactly as before. Nothing had really changed, not in any way that mattered. Except that 5 women had their names back. 5 families had their answers. 5 graves would bear witness to the truth long after everyone who remembered had turned to dust. Except that Danny had kept his promise. To his grandmother, dying in a forest. To his father, searching in the dark. To himself, standing at a crash site in Belgium, vowing to find out why. He had found out. He had told the world. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all anyone could do, shine a light into the shadows, speak the names of the forgotten, refuse to let the silence win. Danny opened a new case file, another family, another mystery, another set of questions without answers. He began to read. Behind him, Evelyn's photograph watched from the wall, her eyes steady, her smile unchanged, a woman who had flown and fought and mattered, a woman who had finally come home.